rise of social media and online communities have given us endless access to all the atrocities of the world. And as such, true crime enthusiasts and casual news watchers alike have seen their fair share of appalling crimes and amazing stories of survival. But none of those stories stand out quite as much as Elizabeth Smart's. Barely a teenager when she was taken from her home, Elizabeth endured 9 months in captivity before being reunited with her family. This incredibly complex case captured my attention well before my fascination with true crime began. It contains basically all the worst parts of man, like substance abuse, violence against women and children, pedophilia, and cults. Yet, despite seeing the worst of humanity with this case, we also see the best. Elizabeth Smart has shown an entire generation what it means to be both kind and resilient, and how to be empathetic yet firm. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Crafty Crimes podcast. I know this upload is a little bit late. I'm sorry. Obviously, I'm still very new to podcasting, and now that work is starting to pick up and get busy, I'm having trouble finding ways to fit it into my schedule. But I'm hoping to get back to something a little more consistent soon. But this episode will be a bit different because it will be part 1 of a 2-part episode. I honestly hadn't anticipated doing a 2-part episode this early on in my podcasting journey, but it felt right with this case. So, this week we will cover all the background information we need to really understand the complexities of this case. And then in the next episode, we'll discuss the actual crime and the court proceedings. And while we do that, I'm going to try to follow the pattern in the description box to make these cute heart center granny squares. I made 2 of them at work. I think they're very cute. Obviously, one's better than the other because one was my first attempt and one was not. But they're very cute, and I am going to try to do that when we talk today. So, let's get started by learning about the LDS church first. So, get comfy and grab your crafting supplies. It's almost impossible to separate Elizabeth's story from the LDS church. The Smart family were devout Mormons at the time of the kidnapping, and Brian Mitchell and Wanda Barzine had connections to the church as well. Elizabeth and her family are actually still devout Mormons to this day. And you know what? Good for them. I'm glad Elizabeth was able to separate what happened to her from her faith. We all need something to help us get through life, and if religion is your thing and it's a good religion, then good for you and good for Elizabeth. You know, she was able to use her faith to help her move forward and heal, which is pretty badass. The LDS, though, had a fascinating and somewhat troublesome start. Honestly, it could be an episode by itself, and maybe it will be one day, depending on whether or not you see it as a cult. And that is an age-old question that will likely never be answered. I fell down the rabbit hole with the lore, and it was almost like being a middle school girl who was way too into Greek mythology again. Like, the lore is just that crazy and fascinating. And so while I would love to tell you about it, not all of it is pertinent to Elizabeth and Elizabeth's story. And ultimately, that's why we're here today. So I'm going to do my best to condense it down so that way you know how it affects the story at hand. But if you would like to read about it yourself, there is a really comprehensive article available on the LDS website, and I think it's PBS that has several helpful articles as well. So the Lord showed himself to 15-year-old Joseph Smith in 1820 to tell him to build a restored church. Over the next 10 years, Smith was visited by reincarnated prophets who led him to the infamous golden tablets. The tablets were then translated by Smith, which gave us the 13 Articles of Faith, which came together to be known as the Book of Mormon. We don't really need to know all 13 articles to understand how Mormon theology influenced Brian's rationale for the crime. The first thing you need to understand is that the LDS believed that anyone who is an official member of their faith can receive divine revelation. This means that God will reveal himself in everyday scenarios to people who are listening. Kind of like how you would see Facebook posts from white Christian women. So it would sound something like, as I impatiently waited for the water to boil, I contemplated microwaving the noodles instead. But then I realized, ... Or, my husband and I had been fighting all week, but he still turned the coffee pot on for me every morning before he left for work. This reminded me that... You know, stuff like that, those kinds of revelations. And overall, I think most members of the LDS Church would agree with that. But when you've been abusing hard drugs since you were 16, and then you're told that you have a direct line to God, well, you might start to believe it, and you can see how things might start to get twisted. And that's not to excuse Brian's deeds. He still did a horrific thing. It's more of a potential explanation. The other thing you need to know about... Oh my goodness, I am just struggling tonight. The other thing you need to know about the 13 articles is that they initially allowed polygamy. Now, present-day members of the LDS Church do not practice polygamy. However, there is a subsect of the religion known as the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, and they do still practice polygamy. That subsect has absolutely nothing to do with Elizabeth and her family specifically. It's just very likely that Mitchell pulled inspiration from these doctrines. I don't want you to go into this episode having a bad impression of Mormons. I do acknowledge that I have some bias, as I am generally not a fan of organized religion. However, Mormonism just seems especially culty to me. A lot of their practices are kept secret. They have their own recognized hierarchy system, and some factions even have exclusive rituals and dress codes. But generally speaking, this religion has influenced thousands into being good-hearted people. So maybe it's not so bad after all, but you can let me know if you consider the Latter-day Saints to be a cult or not in the comments. Okay, so now that we've learned the basics of the religion that shaped Elizabeth's character, let's meet Elizabeth Smart. Ed and Lois Smart welcomed their first daughter and their second child, Elizabeth Ann, into the world on November 3rd, 1987. Ed was a real estate developer and Lois was a homemaker. I'm not sure how prevalent that dynamic is within the LDS church, but I do know quite a few Christian couples who follow this dynamic. Elizabeth has an older brother, 2 younger brothers, and a younger sister, Mary Catherine. The younger sister, Mary Catherine, would be present the night of the abduction and be instrumental into bringing her sister home. Ed and Lois seemed like they were really fantastic present parents. In fact, on the night that Elizabeth had been kidnapped, the family had been out at an award ceremony for Elizabeth at her middle school. And while I don't know the specifics of their parenting style, I imagine it had to be pretty damn good for Elizabeth and her siblings to become so well-rounded, especially after everything that the family went through. I'm getting cold. I'm going to change my shirt and then I'll be right back. Elizabeth had a variety of hobbies and interests. At age 5, she began to play the harp, which is a passion that would follow her into adulthood. By middle school, Elizabeth was playing around her neighborhood for weddings, funerals, and local concerts. She got a bachelor's degree in music from Young University, specializing in the harp, of course, and she has played on national television and at various relatively big events over the years. In addition to her love of the harp, Elizabeth also enjoyed horseback riding and ran cross country. Overall, she was described as quiet, kind, and intelligent. And you know, just the little turd in me is wondering how many times Smart Elizabeth Smart was called Smart. Just some dumb, petty middle school stuff, really. I got way too close to the camera there. I am so sorry. I'm not trying to jump around in the timeline too terribly much, though. But I have gotten a lot of positive feedback when it comes to what my thoughts are on the cases. So I will say that personality-wise, it doesn't really seem like much has changed for Elizabeth. I know that we can only see what's on the outside and, we can only see what face she puts forward. And for all we know, she could be depressed and just in a state of constant turmoil. But from what I can tell, she's still intelligent and kind. She's a very outspoken person, and she's an advocate for child safety and abduction prevention. And she had actually come to my alma mater during my senior year to give a talk. I was not able to go because I had some kind of like scheduling conflict, and honestly, I'm still mad about it to this day. Like, I should have blown off whatever else I had to go watch Elizabeth Smart speak. I was so stupid. Let's meet the third wife of the man who kidnapped, raped, and terrorized Miss Smart, Wanda Barzee. There really isn't a lot to say about Wanda. Whether that's because no one cared about the accomplice or if she kept her life private, I don't know. But Wanda did assist Brian in the torment of Elizabeth. In fact, Elizabeth has said on basically every platform she has, which is all of them, that Wanda watched Brian rape her, encouraged him to do so, and treated her as a slave. So whether the media circus cared about Wanda's role or not, or if her life is kept private because of her plea deal, it doesn't really matter. She was very much an active and willing participant in this whole situation, and she is very much a shitty human. Wanda was born on November 6th, 1945, to Truman Barzee and Dora Corbett. Her parents didn't stay together long, and she had 2 more sisters, though I can't figure out from which parent. In 1964, 19-year-old Wanda married Talmadge Thompson. The pair was married for 20 years and had 6 children together before they divorced in 1984. Shortly after the divorce, Wanda met Brian Mitchell through the LDS church, and the two married in 1985. Wanda and Brian would stay married until 2004. Wanda was released from prison on parole in 2018, with her parole ending in 2023. The Smart family was in direct opposition of her release, but ultimately this cry for justice fell on deaf ears. The parole board believed that Wanda had served sufficient time and was going to be released early for good behavior. Wanda is currently 79 years old and a registered sex offender. Her last known address was near Park Elementary School, which Elizabeth was enraged over for obvious reasons, and publicly called out Utah police for not doing more to protect the kids. Upon her release, Wanda was unsure where she'd go. She served 10 years in a Texas prison before being released on parole and transferred back to Utah. No one in Wanda's family wanted her to live with them. One of her daughters even referred to her as very mentally ill and very manipulative. So until she was able to get a place of her own, Wanda stayed at a halfway house. And that's Wanda. Like I said, there's not really much to say about her, and her update at the end of part 2 will be pretty brief as well. So now it's time to meet Brian David Mitchell, the individual whose history will shape the bulk of this episode. I wanted to include Brian's life story in this so that we get a better picture of who he was and in 2002 and if he's learned anything since. I know Elizabeth has come out and said that she doesn't really care what the reasoning or what the rationale is, because it doesn't change the fact that this was done to her. And that is a totally, valid feeling to have. That's a totally valid statement. And if I were in her shoes, I can't imagine I would feel any differently. But despite her not caring, I do. And I wanted to know. So it is included in this episode. So if for some ungodly reason, if Elizabeth is watching this, I'm sorry. I highly doubt she's ever going to watch it, though, because I think she specifically said that she stays away from media about her life. But anyway, let me reference my pattern and we'll get back to it. Brian was the third of 6 children born to social worker Cheryl and school teacher Irene on October 18th, 1953. It's kind of weird that everyone in this episode has a birthday within 3 weeks of each other, right? How often do you see that in something like this? That's gotta be a 1 in a million chance. I just thought it was interesting. Anyways, by Cheryl's own admission, the Mitchells were not great parents, which is probably a major black spot on the LDS reputation, considering Cheryl and Irene were practicing Mormons at the time they were raising their children. The church has also been the subject of controversy and outrage in recent years, with the leader of the FDLS church, Warren Jeffs. If you remember, the FDLS and the LDS are 2 different subsects, but most people aren't going to know that, so they would lump them all in together. By the age of 8, Cheryl had already exposed Brian to sexually explicit content. Initially, this super sketchy sex ed began with diagrams from medical journals. And while Brian was way too young to learn the specifics of sex, I guess at least Dad tried to make it more educational by pulling it from a medical source, maybe. However, within a few months, pornographic material was left openly around the house, and latchkey kid Brian learned way more than he should have. And this isn't the only questionable parenting choice made by Cheryl either. By the time Brian was 12, Cheryl was dropping him off in unfamiliar areas of Salt Lake City and forcing him to find his way home. Sometimes Cheryl and Irene would go pick Brian up when he didn't make it home on time, and other times they didn't. I don't really know what parenting was like back in 1965, but I think everyone can agree that this is not something a loving, decent parent does. Kids who are exposed to sexual content at an early age grow up to have weird relationships with sex. And based on what's about to happen, I'm wondering if Brian didn't feel violated by the initial introduction into pornography. It's not uncommon for victims of abuse to turn around and become perpetrators and predators against those they see as weaker than them. But in the grand scheme of things, whether or not Brian was a victim of sexual assault or harassment, which he absolutely was, it doesn't excuse his behavior and the deplorable things that he did. Abuse is never your fault, but it's also never an excuse to turn around and victimize someone else. Your healing and your recovery is very much your responsibility. So go to therapy, get a mantra, meditate, or do whatever else you gotta do to get the introspection flowing. At age 16, Brian Mitchell committed his first sex crime. Brian exposed himself to an 8-year-old neighborhood girl and asked her to touch him. The little girl was never named, and for her sake, I hope this stopped at the exhibitionism. I really hope it didn't go any further than that. Brian spent time in a juvenile facility for this stunt, but when he was released, he came home and became combative with his mother and sister specifically. So he was sent to live with his grandma. His grandma was unable to get him in line as well, though, and within just a couple of months of moving in with her, Brian dropped out of high school and began to abuse drugs and alcohol because, he's such a winner. Already we have a bad combination of factors that led to some serious mental health issues. And to borrow a phrase from Asha and Elena of Morbid, you can feel bad for the child, but not for the adult. Obviously, he was abused as a kid. That didn't give him the right to abuse. Sometime in 1972, Brian met, impregnated, and married, in that order, 16-year-old Karen Miner. Brian was 19 at the time his son, Travis, was born. The relationship was short-lived. The couple would have one more child together the following year before splitting up in 1974. Now, Karen also abused drugs and alcohol. So Brian was granted custody of the kids, which is wild because Brian was also an addict at the time. And unfortunately, y'all, I have got to put this yarn up because I am struggling right now. It happens a lot this time of year where I just can't regulate my body temp. I'm just struggling today. So we're going to put the yarn up because it makes it harder to focus and crochet as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed it up to this point. Why Brian got custody of his kids at this point in time is absolutely wild to me because he was also an addict. He had gotten a DUI in the 70s and had also been arrested on drug-related charges. So it's pretty bonkers to me that he got custody of those kids, and I have no clue what the state or the judge was thinking. So maybe if I have a fan who is in the child protection side of the legal program, they can tell me why a judge would do something like this, because if both parents are drug addicts, it doesn't seem like there's a safe parent, but whatever. Anyways, Karen put in the work, sobered up, and got remarried. This newfound stability for Karen meant that she could have her kids back. So the courts granted her custody instead. But Brian was not having this new arrangement, and thus his trouble with the law began again. Brian took the kids across state lines to hide from court orders, and the trio ended up in a Hare Krishna sect on the East Coast. The cult provided food, shelter, and other amenities to the Mitchell family, which would have been unavailable otherwise due to Brian's criminal status. The Hare Krishna is a cult, but also not one. The practitioners of this faith worship the Hindu god Krishna. Krishna is the ninth and strongest reincarnation of Vishnu, the god of harmonious balance and the protector of our world. The mythology says that a 10th and final reincarnation of Vishnu will manifest when the world ends, and it seems like a decent enough god to me. There's nothing particularly ominous about that. And everything I read said that Krishna is just looking to restore the balance between good and evil. So it doesn't seem like the worst god to worship, honestly. The devotees of this religion, though, are admittedly pretty hardcore. They live in a commune, shave their heads, and spend their entire day chanting Hare Krishna Rama. They do this because they believe God is present in his name, and by invoking his name repeatedly, they can call him to earth. To me, that's pretty culty behavior, and most online seem to agree. It doesn't help that the group is especially vague about their practicing, emphasizing that they practice bhakti yoga, chanting, and vegetarianism, and that's it. That's all they advertise. But members of this group do leave their lives behind to fully devote themselves to the cause, and that is the biggest selling point for me when it comes to thinking it's a cult. But you guys can let me know what you think. By 1980, the Mitchells had left the commune and returned to Utah. Brian reunited with one of his brothers, who then reintroduced him to the LDS church. Brian became a regular member again and met his second wife, Debbie Woodridge, through the church. Debbie had also been previously married and had 3 children of her own. The two married in February of 1981, and Brian's 2 children were voluntarily placed in foster care. And can I just say that that's not something I was aware you could do? I was not aware that you could just call up DCFS and be like, hey, I don't want these kids anymore, come get them. And that someone would then come get those kids. Like, that doesn't seem right, but that's what all the sources say. But surely you can't just give away your kids like that, right? Right? Regardless of if you can or can't voluntarily give your kids away, Brian and Debbie ended up having 2 children of their own. This marriage was also short-lived, though, and the divorce was finalized in November 1984. After the divorce, Debbie accused Brian of being sexually inappropriate with their 3-year-old son. Additionally, one of Debbie's daughters came forward with allegations of sexual abuse. So here again, we're seeing that he just has this history of sexually abusing people. Nothing ever came out of these complaints, though, and Debbie claims that LDS elders pressured her into dropping her accusations against Brian. So, yeah, obviously you can see that the scumbag has been an active predator for decades before he targeted the Smart family. For just the things he put Elizabeth through alone, Mitchell deserved the life sentence that he got. But it's so much worse when you realize that he had been getting away with sexual assault for years and years and years before he even met the Smarts. On November 29th, 1984, Brian Mitchell married Wanda Barzee. Their wedding anniversary is the exact same day that Mitchell and Woodridge's divorce was finalized. Personally, I absolutely hate that. I would never get married to someone hours after they got a divorce. That is absolute insanity. I mean, why would you start your marriage with a dark cloud hanging over you like that? But, I mean, I guess Mitchell and Barzee aren't exactly the textbook definition of a healthy couple, so I guess, like, they wouldn't care as much as the rest of us. But still, pick literally any other day. Pick literally any other day. I don't know, but his marriage to Barzee would be his longest relationship. The couple didn't divorce until a year and a half after they had been apprehended, meaning they were legally a couple for about 20 years. The events that happened between the Mitchell-Barzee marriage in 1984 and the Smarts' first encounter with Mitchell in 2001 are largely unknown. At some point, this weird couple would leave the LDS church because Mitchell believed he was receiving special revelations from God that the church wasn't ready to accept. And if you remember from earlier in the episode, Mormons do believe that anyone can receive a revelation from God. However, only church leaders and elders can receive communications that change the fate of the church. That hasn't always been the case. It was anyone could receive any kind of revelation, but as time went on, they kind of changed it and said, okay, well, anyone can receive revelation, but most people will only receive small-scale revelations about themselves. So that's how they got around that one. It's messy and it's kind of complicated, but the point here is that you can very clearly see the influence that religion had on Brian's broken psyche. And obviously, years of drug abuse also contributed to whatever pipe dream he had believed. Even so, though, Mitchell and Barzee spent the 90s living as homeless street preachers. He had also somehow found time to publish his book, the Book of Emmanuel David Isaiah, which was supposed to detail his revelations and where the ideas to take Elizabeth stem from. It's a 27-page manifesto that I didn't bother to read because I don't think that lunatic's ramblings are worth it. And I can almost confidently say that they are ramblings despite not reading it, because I did read his interview with the FBI, and that is nonsensical. So I can't imagine his book is any better. Lois and Ed Smart seem like genuinely good people. so it's really no surprise that Lois worked hard to be a role model for her children. One October day in 2001, Lois met a Charles Manson lookalike by the name of Emmanuel David Isaiah and hired him to do odd jobs around the house. Brian, aka Emmanuel, spent about 5 hours at the Smart House patching the roof and raking leaves. This would be the first time Elizabeth would cross paths with her captor. What was meant to be a kind gesture turned into an absolute nightmare. According to the United States Census Bureau, Salt Lake City, Utah had a population of 182,002 people in 2002. The neighborhood Elizabeth lived in, Federal Heights, was one of the more affluent areas in the metro, but there's no specific data on the population of Federal Heights. It really was just happenstance that Mitchell met the Smarts, and I firmly believe that if he hadn't It really was just happenstance that Mitchell met the Smarts that afternoon, and I firmly believe that if he hadn't victimized them, then it would have been someone else. And as far as anyone knows, this was the only time Elizabeth and her family met Mitchell before the night of her abduction. On June 5th, 2002, Brian Mitchell and Elizabeth Smart would meet each other again in the worst way possible. Summer had just begun for the Federal Heights area. Just a day before, on June 4th, the family had attended Elizabeth's award ceremony and celebrated her transition into high school. June 5th carried on as any other day. Lois burned dinner that evening and left the kitchen window open to air out the house, and the family went to bed with that window still open. Around 1 a.m. on June 5th, Brian David Mitchell broke into the Smart home by climbing in through the open kitchen window. I cannot imagine just how much Ed and Lois blamed themselves knowing that this monster got into their house because they had forgotten to close a window. I bet the guilt ate at them. I know I would have been consumed by it if I were in their place, and I forget to lock the doors all the time. Now inside the home, Brian enters the bedroom shared by Elizabeth and Mary Catherine. The girls are awoken by the sounds of his footsteps. Brian presses a knife to Elizabeth's cheek and tells her not to scream and to come with him, otherwise he'd kill her and her family. Elizabeth leaves her home at knife point in her pajamas and is forced into the mountains by Mitchell. As I read through Brian's disorganized thoughts in his manifesto, the book of Emmanuel David Isaiah, which I did not read fully and really only skimmed, and his police interviews, I found myself wondering if Brian wanted Elizabeth specifically, or if Mary Catherine would have been acceptable if she had been the more accessible sister. As we'll find out after Brian is captured, his goal was to build a harem of virgin daughters so that he could go through with some kind of spiritual transformation to battle the Antichrist. I think it's all mumbo jumbo. It's honestly some serious wackadoodle stuff too. But the point I want to make with it is that it's awfully inconvenient that Brian just happened to be nearby on the one night the Smarts left the window open, and he just so happened to make his way into Elizabeth's room without waking anyone else up. And, there's no way he would have committed the layout to that house on memory when he had only visited it one time prior for 5 hours, 8 months prior. Especially because he was still a heavy drug user at this time. And all of that is a really long way of saying that I think that Brian was staking out the house the night of the kidnapping and for who knows how long before. And that also means that I think that Brian targeted Elizabeth from the start, probably because she was pretty and older. 14 looks a lot more adultish than 11 does, I guess. Not that that excuses anything, but point being, I think Brian targeted Elizabeth. Elizabeth was marched 3 miles away from her home and forced into a lean-to shack where Wanda Barzee waited inside. Wanda washed Elizabeth's feet and then told her to undress. Elizabeth tried to refuse, but Wanda threatened to get Brian and let him rip the pajamas off if she didn't comply. So Elizabeth obliged and was covered with a robe. With Elizabeth now mostly naked and vulnerable, Brian performs some weird kind of marriage ceremony and then rapes Elizabeth for the first time. I don't need to tell you how horrific of an experience this was for Elizabeth. And of course, it gets worse because it always does. When she's not being raped, Elizabeth is tied to a tree with a steel cable. When Brian entered the room the Smart sisters shared, Mary Catherine was awake. But the younger Smart girl also feared for her life, so she stayed quiet and pretended to be asleep as her sister was taken from their bedroom. 2 hours after her sister had been forced from the home, Mary Catherine woke her parents to tell them what had happened. Ed and Lois immediately called the police, and a $250,000 reward was put out for Elizabeth's safe return. While the Smart family searched for their daughter, Elizabeth continued to live in hell. She was only released from her bindings when Brian wanted to rape her, which would be up to 4 times a day. Wanda sat and watched as her husband raped a child and often encouraged him to do so. In the early days of her captivity, Elizabeth recalls being chained to that tree and hearing the search parties call for her. Brian threatened to take her life if she called out or tried to escape. And this would be the first of many near rescues for Elizabeth. How frustrating and heartbreaking is that? I can't imagine how hopeless she felt in those moments to know that rescue was so close but so far away at the same time. And to watch it slip through your fingers just again and again, like that's gotta kill you, And that, dear friends, is where we're gonna leave off today. I know it's frustrating, and I can totally understand if this episode was not for you. But I hope you're starting to see why I wanted to spend some time covering the background information first, because I promise it is all relevant. And if you don't see it yet, you will very, very soon. If this whole thing isn't making a lot of sense to you right now, don't worry. I'm going to be getting part 2 up before the 2-week mark, so you'll be able to watch both episodes back to back, hopefully, and it'll make a lot more sense. The monstrosities we're about to learn about, though, are the direct result of a strict, life-consuming religion mixed with a drug-addled mind. I didn't finish my Granny Square Heart. Like I said, I'm just struggling. My hands are really too sweaty to grip the yarn properly, so it's coming out with a bunch of insanely loose stitches. It happens sometimes. Hopefully it'll be better when I record part 2. But for the 2 that I do have made, what do you think that I should do with them? I made them without any goal in mind, as I'm known to do, and now I don't know. Should I give them to my kids to use as pot holders for their kitchen sets? Should I learn to sew and make a tote bag with them? what ideas do you have? Let me know. I'll be back soon with part 2 of Elizabeth's story super, super soon. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to choose kindness where you can. Unless you can show kindness towards someone who takes teenage girls out of their bedrooms in the middle of the night, in which case I hope you choose to be a jerk, because that person deserves jerkness. But otherwise, choose kindness, stay crafty, and I will be seeing you guys very, very soon. Bye!